Russia. Like America, a wide country, rich in natural beauty. It has inspired some of the world's greatest musicians, writers. But for its people outside the ruling class, Russia in the early 1900s offered more of hardship than of beauty. Tsar Nicholas was in the final years of his reign. He didn't know it at the time, but he was the last of the czars of Russia. His fatal mistake: he ignored the growing unrest of a hard-pressed people at a time when it could no longer be ignored. The Tsar's authority crumbled. It appeared that a genuinely democratic reform might be established. This the communists did not want. Lenin, who had not been in Russia when the revolution began, came back and got to work. Under the direction of Lenin and others, the Bolsheviks took over the popular revolution. They were much in the minority, but they were organized and they had no reservations.
Since the Bolshevik Revolution, back in 1917, when Russia became a communist nation, our relationship with them has been, well, dodgy. They've been our rival, our arch enemy, and yet, at times, a strong ally, especially during World War II. Well, 6 decades and a Cold War later, throw in a crisis in the Middle East, and our relationship is getting chilly once again. So, why all the drama? I know just who to ask. My buddy, Buck Sexton, from Real News.
Good to see you, Raj.
How are you?
Good.
So, in the beginning, we were kind of allies with them, right?
It's a little more complicated than that because the Soviets actually had an agreement with the Nazis that allowed the Soviets to increase their sphere of influence, essentially take over a whole bunch of countries in Eastern Europe, be in control of them, and they wouldn't bother each other. But then Hitler and the Nazis decided to declare war on Russia, and then that brought them into the war. Now, what's also interesting, and people don't generally know this, is that far more German soldiers, more armored divisions went up against the Soviets than went up against us in the Western Front. The brunt of Hitler's war machine was broken at Stalingrad and by the Soviets, and the Soviet losses were unimaginable. Millions of people died.
Now, you see pictures of like Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin sitting together, and it's almost kind of weird because immediately after World War II, things got really awkward.
Well, there was a conference at Yalta, and essentially what happened was that once the German war machine, the Nazi war machine, had been defeated, we allowed an Iron Curtain to form, that's what we ended up calling it, in which the West would be in charge west of the Berlin Wall, and the Russians would be in charge of their side of things, and that included Poland and all of Eastern Europe. And so essentially you divided all of Europe into 2 halves, one with the U.S. Allegiance and one with a Soviet allegiance, and this continued on for decades.
What was life like during the Cold War? What does that even mean, Cold War?
It was really a battle for influence around the world. It was 2 competing global ideologies, communism on the one hand and capitalism and freedom on the other. And what ended up happening was that this was played out in various places, in various stages, all around the world. Now, we never went toe-to-toe because both sides had nuclear missiles and major nuclear capability, but there were some instances, the Cuban Missile Crisis comes to mind, where things got very tense and very scary.
Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were at the brink of like the annihilation of the world during that like 13 days, right?
People say that it was the closest we've ever come to a nuclear exchange. The problem is that under a nuclear exchange scenario, we face something called, people call it MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD, which meant they fire missiles, we fire missiles, or we fire missiles, they fire missiles, which, based upon some of the assessments, would essentially mean the end of life on Earth as we know it. That fortunately did not happen, but it gives you a sense of just how dangerous these times were. And yes, children were doing drills in school where they had to hide under desks. Only later did people point out that this probably wouldn't do much in the event of a nuclear attack, but there was just a mentality, a bunker mentality, a siege mentality of what is going to happen to the world when this war comes, because people thought that that war would come. Instead, we fought proxy wars in places like Vietnam, in places like Afghanistan, where communism and the West and capitalism faced off against each other somewhere else. '89 is when the Berlin Wall came down. 1961 is when it went up. So that gives you a sense of just how long this thing was there. And as I said, it was a physical dividing line between East, as in the Soviet Communist East, and West, meaning American dominance, capitalism, free markets, etc. And once that wall came down, then all of a sudden there was a sense of what now? What happens? But a lot of the old issues and alliances and problems from the past sort of have continued on even to present when it comes to the U.S. and Russia. And they view anything they can do to push back U.S. influence as good, especially in areas that they used to control: Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. They feel like that's their backyard. And so while we want those countries to be free and democratic and prosperous, they want them to be Russian and maybe a little democratic and maybe a little prosperous.
Now, help me understand this. Is there like a legitimate threat that we might go to some sort of conflict with these people, or is it all kind of a show game?
The problem is really one of influence right now. It's a question of the Russians playing a long game, looking at how they can increase their dominance, their influence, their friendships around the world, not a year out, but 5, 10, 20 years out. They're trying to look strategically. So they're trying to build their influence, Raj, and they're also trying to hold on to places like Syria, for example, which we see in the news a lot now. Why do they care so much about Syria? They have a naval base in Syria, which means they have a naval base in the Mediterranean. This means the projection of power. Now, the Russians have seen sort of a dip in their influence in the world, but they still think of themselves as a great global power that is on the rise. So they're not enemies, but they are in a constant state of influence conflict, I would say. They're in a constant state of gamesmanship, of statecraft, trying to play out their allegiances, meaning their friends, other countries that they're working with, and see who can, in the future, become the preeminent, dominant global power. Because the Russians once thought of themselves as right there with us, and yeah, we thought we've won this whole thing, but guess what? They're still a very big country. They still have a lot of wealth, under the surface particularly, and going into the future, they think that Russia is going to be a very powerful player, so we have to keep an eye on them. Are we going to go to war with Russia anytime soon? Fortunately, I can say no, we don't have to worry about that. But are the Russians our friends? Can we look to them to be responsible on the international stage, to be responsible with humanitarian concerns and be fair? I don't think so.